Hello and welcome back to the channel. I was hoping to... I'm just kidding. I wasn't hoping to get this book out earlier. It takes a lot of energy and motivation for me to even do a video, so I think we should just be grateful that I'm here and present. So I wanted to do a book for Summerween, but now that it's August, and by the time that this comes out, it will most likely be like the end of August, if not the beginning of September. So timeline of things, I'm like, okay, this is actually a good book that could be for spooky season, and if I get it out soon enough, maybe for Summerween as well. So we're wearing Hocus Pocus regardless, because to me, spooky season starts ASAP. So it's August. It's August when I'm filming this. It's already spooky season, or at least we're pre-gaming it. So I know normally I do a lot of ranting on my side of this channel, but I actually really enjoyed this book. So we'll be talking about Slewfoot by Brom today. So I kind of want to do a brief summary, and then just kind of go over like things I liked, things I didn't. A couple of content warnings though, so to kind of like get a feel if it's something that you would be interested in doing. It does have a fair bit of gore in it, especially like honestly the last 50 pages, because this is for the girls. This is really witchcraft, but make it revenge. That's basically like we're supporting women's rights and wrongs in this book. I'd also say a warning for physical abuse. There is a character in here who is an absolute asshole. He is very clearly written to be hated, and so just fair warning with that. And given that this takes place in the 17th century in a very strict Puritan culture, there's a lot of misogyny. Kind of comes with the territory. And then along with that, because it is supposed to take place in the 17th century, you are going to see some racism, specifically with Native Americans, because there is a Native American tribe that kind of lives near where their community is. So that all aside, the very last one is there's really like no spice to this book, which would make sense. It is a horror book first and foremost. There is like one implied intimate scene, but it's not explicit by any means. Which, now that we're kind of in that realm of spice versus no spice, I need to take a moment. I need to take a moment and have a rant tangent. I see this mostly in the book talk community, and you'll see it as well on Instagram. You don't really see it a lot on YouTube, because let's be honest, a lot of booktube is making fun of really trashy books, and a lot of really trashy books that had just god-awful sex scenes, right? But I need to just take a moment and invite people who get upset when books don't have spice. I need them to go outside and touch some grass. That's the tangent for today, because I always see comments of like, oh, here are 5 fantasy romantasy books that I recommend, and I have seen in the wild comments being like, oh, it wasn't spicy enough. Oh, you thought having 3 sex scenes in a book was spicy? That's not spicy. To me, it almost feels like, hey, this show, I don't want to watch this show unless it has a sex scene every other episode. Like, do you understand how absolutely insane? That sounds insane. That is wild to have that stipulation and to have that be a requirement. I understand, yes, books are a very different medium compared to watching actual people act out those sort of things, but I just think we need to kind of think about what we're asking and what we are demanding when it comes to smut or spice, yada yada yada. Because as much as I dislike the ACOTAR series, I'm not going to say it is peak smut. Like, girl, if you are complaining about a book not having enough spice, you want erotica. Romantasy is not inherently erotica. they're not one and the same. And so it irritates the hell out of me when I see people like, there was an implied sex scene, why didn't it just show a sex scene? Do I know if people have commented about that, like about this book specifically? No, I don't. That's why this is a tangent. It's just something I needed to get off my chesticles. That all being said, that had nothing to do with this, but that might be maybe for another day. We'll see if that becomes a rant for another day. So, brief summary on this, now that we're back to the topic at hand. I will do my darndest to not give away too many spoilers. But Slewfoot is about a young lady who is living in, I believe, Connecticut, which at that time, it's just a colony. So it doesn't matter all that much. But let's say Connecticut. So she is from England. Her name is Abatha. Like Tabitha, but without the T. But for some reason, while I was reading the book, I always wanted to read it as Abitha. So I think I'm just going to call her Abby, just for sake of my own sake. So with Abby, she is from England. She kind of grew up in a pretty broken home. Her dad was a drunk. He was a mean drunk. And her mom died several years back. But her mom always kind of had like this innate, like, very like folksy type of magic connection. And she encouraged that in Abby herself. So after her mom dies, this is all like past tense. We don't actually see this, but we get this through her chatting about it. So after her mom dies, Abby is basically like a mail order bride, for lack of a better term, to a man in a Puritan village in Connecticut. His name is Edward. So at the start of the book, they've been married for a couple years, and they actually have like a pretty decent marriage, as pretty decent as one could have when you're a woman in a Puritan community in 1666 or whatever. But Edward, he treats her pretty well, but you can tell like he doesn't stand up to his brother, who is just awful to the both of them, but like especially to Abby. And then on top of that, she just feels like an outsider in this community, which she is. She didn't grow up Puritan. She more so was like a Protestant back in England. And so it, you know, different vibes, obviously, if you look at all like the religious context at that time. And on top of that, you look at like the folk magic with her mom, she has to really keep that on the down low because the whole book is about witchcraft. You feel me? That's all happening with Abby. And then on the flip side, outside of their farm in the forest, you see as the reader, there is something in the ground, in like a deep hole in the ground at the base of this dying tree is some sort of entity, and it's very like vague. You don't know what it is, but they are starting to, something ancient, and from the reader's perspective, like, and probably not a very good thing, is starting to awake after being asleep for many, many years. In the beginning of the book, I don't want to spoil too much, but her husband, it is made aware, like, I'm not spoiling anything, that she becomes a widow. Her husband dies. That happens very early on in the book. Don't come for me. Her husband dies, and this puts Abby at risk of losing the farm because Wallace, the brother-in-law, I don't remember if I mentioned his name, but we don't like him. Wallace basically like underhanded them to where there's a risk that he inherits the farm unless Abby can pay off certain debts. That was not supposed to be the case after Edward died. So she would have been okay, but then this all happened because, of course, Wallace is awful. And he's like, actually, I need the farm to pay off my debts because I'm the worst. So Abby is struggling to run a farm by herself. She has to plant all these crops, and she's struggling. But at the same time, she notices, like, on the outskirts of her farm, this strange creature that she's like, that's not a man. that looks like the devil. And she kind of does have like the, oh, that's interesting. That could be Satan himself. That could be old Slewfoot, because apparently, I didn't know this, apparently that is a term one uses for the devil. But she actually like befriends him, and he looks like this. He's kind of like a tall goat man, because the goat on their farm originally fell in this hole and died, and so he like kind of, I don't know how to describe it, absorbs the goat's appearance. The goat's name was Samson, so Abby refers to him as Samson because this dude does not remember anything about his past. He just kind of wakes up in this hole, and then he's like, I don't know who I am or where I came from. I just feel this like innate need and desire to protect the forest and like, you know, wildlife, etc. But he teaches Abby how to connect with nature and use magic. So she does that to grow her crops, and it's great and awesome. It's really cool to see like that the source of magic in this book is very like nature based, if you will. Like there's just an inherent like energy in the earth that you can connect with. I know that I said that this book is not sexual at all, but like there is almost like an odd sense of like, it feels a little, it does feel a little like sensual when he's first like showing her how to use magic and they're using it for the corn crops. This is another little tangent, I'm sorry. It does feel a little like, I felt like I was kind of blushing while I was reading. Maybe that was intentional. I don't know. I feel like I'm blushing now talking about it. I was like, do they need a room? That all aside, Wallace, because we hate him, he sabotages this whole thing. He doesn't know like how her crops are growing so well, but he sabotages them. That's an issue, and she's starting to kind of like run into more issues in town because she is working so hard on this farm. One of the like head reverends at the village allows her to take time off, like going to church, because he knows how busy she's working. His name's Reverend Carter, and we do like him. Yeah, I'd say that. By the end, I was like, I feel bad for him. And he allows her to do that, but now it's starting to kind of catch up to her, and people are starting to suspect, like, is she a witch? Which, I mean, yeah, technically. So while Abby is doing all of this with her farm stuff and she's struggling with Wallace, Samson is having like a come to Jesus moment where he is trying to figure out who he is, where he comes from, yada yada yada. There are like these magical creatures. Forest folk, if I remember correctly, is like how they refer to themselves. Kind of with their help, he gets a better understanding of like who he is, but he's starting to worry like, shoot, I don't want to be this killer who just punishes people and kills people. Like, I can be good. I can do good things, and we see that through his interactions with Abby. For sake of spoileries, he does end up in a situation where he is kind of trapped and can't help Abby, but he actually is now able to fully grasp his past and who he is, what he is really, and the entity that he is basically like this embodiment of life and death. And it's really interesting to see like through the perspective of this Puritan culture, and even through Abby's like Protestant Christian lens, they do think he's the devil. They equate him to the devil or Slewfoot because they're seeing it through their perspective, right? But when he finds out who he is and his whole past, there are other like different types of folklore that you can tie him into. Like he truly is just the embodiment of life and death and nature itself, and just that like whole circle of life. So while he is capable of good, he is also capable of what we would deem as bad. Which even that, like it almost feels like a little subjective, because you get the whole like, that's life, baby, kind of sense. So while he's doing that, Abby's in really hot water because she has now been accused of witchcraft because of her bitch-ass brother-in-law. And so she is put on trial. And of course she's found guilty because that's always how it went. And she is being... they don't hang her. Well, they hang her upside down. A common misconception is like witches burned at the stake at that time. Not really. Most, like, if you were a white woman, you were killed in other ways. And I do like that was, as weird as that sounds, like that was properly portrayed in the book. She's hung upside down, and so she's starting to die very slowly. This took a very morbid turn. She gets saved by Samson, who, now that he knows who he is, what he is in his final form, if you will. He rescues her, and then he kind of makes this proposition of like, I can save your life, I can help you exact revenge on this village who has very clearly wronged you, but it will transform you. The last bit of the book is just they just go to town and absolutely exact revenge. I will just put it that way. All in all, it is a book clearly about revenge, but I would also say like it explores the themes of like religion and deconstructing that. And I'd say also like reconnecting to things of nature, and through like Samson's thing, like connecting to where he fits in with nature and like how the whole cycle of life kind of works and how he embodies that, and how it's kind of his responsibility to help preserve nature as much as he can, type of thing. So really on like his end, that's his whole deal. With Abby, it really is like a critical look at how she was raised, how she grew up, and how those things have harmed her, how harmful religion and ideas about women have harmed her. And you see it through like not being able to have the farm for herself, not being trusted to do that, being thwarted, being accused of witchcraft, just for like trying to survive. And I think to mirror that, it also kind of explores the themes of like of sisterhood, because she has her mother's past, and the magic of her mother that she kind of talks about is connection with other women, and how that was a source of protection and comfort for Abby throughout the book. Things that I liked, I would say overall it was a great like spooky vibe. That's why we're having this conversation now. I also think Abby was a very likable character, and on top of being a likable character, I also feel like she was written in a way where it didn't feel like objectifying her experience as an outsider, you know, like it didn't really feel like, oh, she's not like other girls, she's a witch. Like it wasn't like that at all. I think Brom did a good job of writing this book through a woman's perspective. Like it didn't feel off in ways that it's some like that's not what a woman would think or do. You know what I mean? Like I do feel like he did a pretty good job with that. And as well, like the writing didn't feel anachronistic. Like it felt like it fit in the century that it was supposed to. There weren't terms being used or things like that where you're like, that feels weird. For example, like if you've read Fourth Wing, they just say weird shit in that book where you're like, this is a fantasy world. They say things like, for the win. Like, you know when you can tell, like, okay, a millennial wrote this. That's not the era that this book should be taking place. This did a really good job of keeping you grounded in the time frame in which it takes place. And I already talked about this, but I did really love Abby's connection, like, with her late mother and this whole like folk magic and how it tied to womanhood, and how that really kind of connected with her and kept her going through hard times, especially because she spends so much of the book alone. And I already kind of talked about, you know, the themes of Samson and his acceptance of learning who he is. And then the last thing just being like the more subtle take on Abby's like thoughts about what she believes, like her whole worldview of Christianity, and how does someone like Samson come into play, and the one she learns about magic and just like how that impacts nature and the past, like everything connected, but it really like shatters her worldview, both in a more Protestant Christian lens, but also like a very strict Puritan lens. There's like a whole deconstruction there, and I thought that was really neat. Again, like it doesn't beat you over the head with it, but like it still makes sense in the setting that we're talking about. You know, like we're not throwing out therapist terms, that sort of thing, when she's thinking about all these things, but you can really clearly tell like, oh, she's deconstructing. That's very interesting. There really wasn't a lot that I disliked about this book. If I remember correctly, it may have been a 5-star read for me, which I'm really picky. I don't really give out 5-star ratings. Even if I love a book, I'm still really picky. This may have been, but don't quote me on that. There were just a couple things that I didn't love. One's really, really nitpicky, and it's when Samson is learning about his past, and the character, for spoilers I won't say, but there's a character who's like talking to him about his past and like trying to get the gears turning, and it's like, yeah, don't you remember that you're called, like, some people know you as the devil, some people know you as Slewfoot, and then they just start listing off like all these different terms mainly like in folklore that Samson could be tied to. They all made sense in my head. I was like, yeah, that makes sense, especially because some of them I had to Google and look up, like, does that make, and they all checked out except for Wendigo. And then this is so nitpicky of me. Basically, like, when Samson transforms to his final form, I will show you a picture of it. He looks like, oh, I almost crinkled it. Can you see that? That's what he looks like. So he used to look like this, a little goat man, which that is more like a Christian, like that's kind of how like we see the devil type of thing, right? Very like Christianized type of vibes. This is his final form. He has basically like a stag head, and it makes sense. You'd have to read it. It makes sense as to why he looks like that at the end. But one of the terms that he is attributed to is a Wendigo, and I only nitpick this because for one of my own writing projects, I have done a lot of research into Wendigos because they are commonly like misconstrued in popular media, and I blame Supernatural for this. No, I don't, but they don't help. There is a misconception of like Wendigos in movies and TV shows are often portrayed as these creatures that have typically like an elk head or an elk like skull. They have antlers like an elk does, and they're very tall and kind of like animalistic. So with my own writing project, I wanted to make sure that I had it right based on the indigenous folklore surrounding Wendigos. And maybe I'm wrong, but from what I found specific to like the folklore of the tribes that I am kind of fixated on for my own writing project and wanting to get the right folklore there, that's not how Wendigos look. Like, that's not how they're portrayed. They're more human-like, if you will, because they're more in the sense of like kind of like zombies. They're like, the whole folklore of a Wendigo comes from the act of cannibalism, because it kind of stems from the idea of someone turning into a Wendigo when they have consumed human flesh. So the folklore around them kind of pops up in times of plague and famine, like that sort of thing. So it kind of stems from this idea of like, you lose your humanity when you do something as heinous as kill another person and eat their flesh. And so it transforms you into this not quite human creature who has this insatiable hunger. That, from all the research I've done, that's more so of what a Wendigo is. Not so much has antlers, etc., but you do see that in shows like Supernatural. I don't really remember how, like, where that first type of imagery first popped up, but it's been around for a while. And I could also be wrong that, like, maybe there is some folklore where they are portrayed in that way, but my nitpick was that from all the research I've done, Wendigos don't really fit into the scheme of Samson's whole thing of, like, he's this entity that's supposed to uphold like life and death. It did feel kind of like an outlier, just based on Samson looks like an elk-headed dude, right? So that's one. That was like such a nitpicky thing. The other thing was, at the very end, there's something that happens where Abby does like something really, really just brash decision, no thought, and it felt out of character for her, and it really just felt like an excuse for her to be injured. And I was reading that because I'm like, oh wow, this is so good. And then it gets to that part and I was like, that doesn't seem like something she would do. Like, or if she was going to do that, it could have been written in a better way to where, like, she is, to really portray, like, she is so, like, blood hungry, like, has so much bloodlust that she kind of loses a sense of good decision making. And I didn't feel like, if that was supposed to be intentional, it wasn't done well enough, and it just kind of felt like she wouldn't do that. My girl, she wouldn't do that. So that was like the only other thing that I didn't super love, but I would give it a pass. And then these aren't necessarily like things that I dislike. I do think there are a couple of misconceptions about this book that I have seen, like, kind of floating around, of people being like, why do we spend so much time into POVs? Why do we spend so much time on Samson? I think the misconception there is, like, I think having the two POVs makes it more impactful, because otherwise it would just feel like Samson is there as a way as like a get out of jail free. Like, it would be too convenient if he didn't have his own stuff going on. And I think him having his own arc allows him to truly be his own character. And then on top of that, like, they have two separate arcs. I think they are portrayed differently. I would say Abby's feels a little more subtle, but it's no less impactful. But I think it works well, the fact that they do have, like, this is two main characters. That's really how I went into it. And I wonder if, like, maybe that misconception comes because the way that the little, like, summary is written makes it seem like it is just Abby's story, but I think it actually works out better that they do have two POVs and two main characters going through this. Otherwise, Samson truly would just feel like a deus ex machina, just in there to help out when he's needed. I'd love to know if you guys have read it, or if you do have any other book recs kind of in the same vein as this. I am all ears. Love me some spooky books. That's all I have for you today, so bye, Mom.